got a report of a missing husband. He told his wife and family of 6 that he was going to get his tires changed, but never returned, and this was 12 hours ago. They had purchased another house in the neighboring community, and the relationship with the wife was under pressure, so the wife assumed he was staying at the other house and claimed he would never kill himself. The strange thing about this report, though, was that he emptied his personal bank account into his wife's this morning as well. The wife explained this off, saying that they had recently had a fight about finances, and he agreed that he was bad with money and maybe they should just have a joint account that she controls. On a hunch, I asked his 14-year-old son if there were any areas in the mountains nearby that his father enjoyed going to, and the son identified a road about 10 miles away. It was nearly midnight, but I decided to drive to the top of this old and abandoned Forest Service road. As I drove through the snow and started to climb, I felt a gut feeling that I would 100% find this guy up there, either thinking about or actually have already acted out a suicide. The snow-laden gravel had some signs of travel, but no real indication of how fresh the tracks could be. As I reached the top of the road after about an hour of travel, I was honestly surprised that I didn't find his black truck. I spent the drive back down thinking about gut feelings and how they are unreliable, but how I somehow felt different about this one. As I traveled up the road, I did notice over a dozen smaller roads branching off, but they were not mapped and I had already spent too much time on a single occurrence in a busy city with too few police officers. Nonetheless, I decided to check one of these secondary roads, and about 3/4 of the way down, I picked a road at random to check, and sure enough, my headlights lit up the back end of a truck about 100 yards past the first corner. Even if I hadn't memorized the license plate beforehand, I wouldn't have had to run it. It was clearly his. I radioed that I had found the truck, parked my vehicle, and traveled the 20 feet to his truck with my heart beating like I'd just finished a sprint. What I found inside was a mess of brains and blood caused by a self-inflicted shotgun wound under the chin. There was just something about this gut feeling while traveling this abandoned and quiet mountain road, followed by a sense of being tricked by the gut feeling, then finding out that it was true by discovering such a gruesome scene, having to wait 3 hours next to his truck waiting for body removal, and to top it all off, to end up having to go back to this family who was expecting good news and deliver to them the worst news possible. That makes me feel creeped out to this very day. 911 dispatcher reporting in. Received a call from an elderly lady who was having trouble breathing. I had taken several calls from her and her husband in the past, so I recognized her voice. I dispatched an ambulance to her residence and held her on the line, trying to keep her calm while the ambulance was en route. The ambulance advised a 15-minute ETA. She lived in a very rural part of West Virginia. I'm talking to her, asking her about her husband and how he's doing, and just making small talk with her. The ambulance calls in and advises that they are on the scene, and I let them know that she is in severe respiratory distress and I still had her on the line. I let her know that the ambulance is coming to the door to go and answer the door, and she says okay and hangs up the phone. Pretty normal, yeah? Well, here's where it gets weird. The EMT and paramedic on scene call back about a minute later and advise that no one's answering the door. We have a sheriff unit who is in the area pulling up on scene at the same time. The sheriff unit confirmed the address and advised he is breaching the door to get access. 5 minutes go by and the paramedics on scene radio in asking who the caller was. I advised that it was an elderly woman that lived at the residence. He tells me he's going to call in and needs to speak with the supervisor on shift. We get him over to the supervisor, and the supervisor confirms the information that I gave him and asks what's going on. Apparently, the elderly female had been dead for a while and was actually in full rigor mortis. They thought I was wrong on the caller, but the other dispatcher played it back and confirmed that it was a female who called. The ambulance transferred the hospital, and we got the same calls and disbelief from the doctors. few years ago, we had an apparent suicide, pedestrian versus train. Hispanic male in his early 20s left a note and decided to take a nap on the tracks. It was a mess. I mean, a real horror show of a mess. And anyone who has ever worked a rail-grade collision knows that your investigation really takes the back seat to getting the train moving again. So we're working like crazy to get everything in order so we can release the train. Well, and this is the creepy part, the family claimed we missed some things out there, personal property of the deceased. I guess, according to the mom and grandma, this kid had a big, gaudy gold cross necklace he loved more than life itself. We searched for it and never found it. We even came back with a canine unit before I made the PSD unit and tried to find it in an area search. No dice. At this point, it's just gone. Disappeared into thin air. Well, this guy's little brother is a 17-year-old kid with a chip on his shoulder. He goes out there at night a few hours after we clean up to look for himself. Before he went out, he told his friends and family that the cops were worthless and that we weren't trying to help. I shit you not, you could not make this up. He gets hit by a different train in almost the same damn spot on the tracks. You could still see the bloodstains on the shale. So sure as shit, we go out. I was on the red-eye 12 shift from 1900 to 700, and I'm not even kidding. We find this poor kid over 100 feet off the tracks, and he's got the gold chain clutched in his hand. That's some Final Destination shit. My dad worked in a precinct with one of the highest crime rates in New York City. I think it had the highest murder rate during his years on the job. Anyway, he won't tell us stories about what he's seen because they're mostly horrific, and they still give him nightmares almost 15 years off the job. However, I do remember he told us one story when he was really drunk. A woman in her 20s walked into her apartment building late from work one night and was waiting for the elevator. It opened, and the only person in there was a creepy-looking guy. Though apprehensive, she got in and pressed her floor number, but noticed that the basement button was pressed. Normally, after 9 p.m., maintenance would lock the basement button to prevent random people from going down there, and I guess someone forgot to lock it. The creepy guy ended up taking her down there, tying her up, and raping and torturing her for hours. He then took her apartment key, went up to the floor she'd pressed when she'd gotten on the elevator, tried every door until he found hers, and took her roommate, also a woman in her 20s, into the basement where he continued torturing and raping them both until dawn. Maintenance found them that morning, and my dad was a responder. Again, my dad never told us stories. This one must have stuck out because he has 4 daughters, but I think this has gotta be up there in the creepy factor. I responded to a report of an unresponsive infant. When I arrived, all the family members were standing around casually in the front yard pointing into the house. I found the baby in the back room lying on her back on a bare mattress. I started CPR but realized the baby was probably already deceased. We rushed her out to the arriving ambulance, hoping that they had a way to bring her back. I learned she was the mother's second suspicious SIDS death, and I had her other children removed from her care. The difficult part was when I left the scene and went to the ER to see what came of the situation. As I walked in and asked where she was, an ER nurse walked over to me and handed me the deceased baby swaddled in a blanket and told me to wait for someone to show me to the morgue. So I'm standing there in the ER in uniform, holding what everyone thinks is a live infant, but rather an infant corpse, and several people stop by wanting to see her and commenting how cute it is to see an officer holding a baby. I just smiled, but it killed me inside. I was ushered back to the morgue after what felt like an eternity, and was told that I had to wait with the baby until the medical examiner arrived. They took the blankets off and laid her on a stainless steel gurney and left me alone with her again. I lounged around the morgue for about an hour waiting. By the time I got home several hours after the end of my shift, because this call came in 15 minutes before the end of my 10-hour shift, I laid down on my bed and cried for a long time. My young daughter was in daycare and my wife at work. I really needed to hold both of them, so the house felt incredibly empty. My daughter was only slightly older than the infant, and when I was looking at her earlier, I kept seeing my own daughter. I didn't get any sleep at all before going back in for the next shift later that night. Thanks for watching. Stay vigilant, friends.